All right, well, good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Plekenpol, and this is Wells Branch Community Church. I'm the lead pastor here, and I'm excited to see all of your bright and shining faces. And we are in April now, and things are starting to, sort of warm up to Texas standards. And I love this season because it reminds me of when I was growing up and the time of the year when my dad had an old 1969 MGB. If you have no idea what that is, think Mazda Miata with a lot of chrome, all right? And so, he had it in the house or in the garage for years, and it never worked because one day when I was 3, my mom drove it without oil. Anyway, another story, another sermon. And so anyway, it would sit there, and every summer I would go and just sit in the garage in my dad's car just one day. I'm going to drive this car. And I didn't know anything about stick shifts, but it had a stick shift, and I would just kind of and do the gears. And, I was 8, and then I was 9, then I was 10, then I was 11, then I was 12, then I was 13, then I was 14, continue doing that. And then one year, my dad said, we are going to fix this thing. And so we, fiberglass the floorboard, which had been completely, rotted out. And then we, got a racing camshaft, and we got new pistons because it was messed up, and we had to bore the whole thing out. It was an incredible experience with my dad that I got to kind of work on this car, and then eventually we got to drive it. And then I'll never forget, on my 16th birthday, my dad drove home the MG, and he got me vanity license plates. All right, so this is how awesome this time was. And it said Plex Star, and I was like, I'm about to rock my school. And so, in fact, I did. I would drive in, and I just thought I had racing seatbelts and a roll bar. There was nothing cooler than that. And every day I'd come home, and I would park the car in the middle of the street, at the beginning of the street. And my house was at the very end of the street. And I would be in my own little world. And I'd rev the engine, and I'd rev it hard. I'm going to get it 4,000, up maybe 5,000 RPMs. I'd throw it into first. It would peel out, you know what I mean? And then, and I'm like, yeah! And the goal was to get to 60 miles an hour before I hit my house on my residential street. And there were these old people. I mean, they were ancient. Guy was 30. And he would scream at me every time I'd roar down. And we took off the muffler at one point. Okay, so it not only was it was just awesome, right? I mean, I'm floating, this guy screams, and I'd be because I was 16 years old and I could do what I want to do. And I'd pull into the driveway, I'd push the little button to make the garage go up, zip in, push the button, the garage go down. Safe. Okay. And because I was living under something that maybe you've lived under. It's a cultural motto, and we say it all the time. I can do what I want to do, when I want to do it, with whomever I want to do it with, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. We all say it. It doesn't hurt anybody. And the problem is what that saying is, and we kind of believe it. I mean, look, I'd say, look, I didn't hurt anybody, I didn't kill anybody today. Instead of saying something like this, I can do what I want to do when I want to do it, as long as it helps somebody. We don't ever say that. We always say, it didn't hurt anybody. I mean, why not? And so that's kind of our cultural mantra. And the problem with that, we're going to find out, is that we don't want to be told what to do, is really what that is. I don't want you to tell me what to do, and as long as I'm not hurting anybody, you can't tell me what to do. And so what we are saying is that there are no consequences to my actions, and so therefore don't try and put consequences on me because I know there aren't any. And so this morning, we're starting a series called Making My Morality. And the reason we're doing this is we're going to watch what happens to God's people. I mean, this is God's people we're going to watch when they kind of go from I believe in God to I don't know if I really believe in God anymore. They kind of do that. They go from that part where they go, I really love God. God is my everything. I will never forsake you. And then something it starts with I don't know. I mean, let's bring in some other of the cultural gods. Let's bring that in. And then everything sort of spirals and spirals and spirals until you don't even recognize it anymore. So that's kind of where we're going with this whole series, Making My Morality. We're going to be in the book of Judges. All right. I know some of you are where is that? Don't worry. If you don't have a Bible, raise your hand in the air, wave like you do care, and I will tell you where it is. Because if you don't have a Bible, we want everybody here to have a Bible. If you don't have one at all, this is our gift to you. happy weekend after Easter. And we're going to be in the book of Judges, roughly page 200 in the book we passed out. And we are going to be looking at this specific timeline. And I didn't make this timeline because it's way too much awesomeness to be mine. I got this from BibleHistory.com. You'll see my clip art in a second. And we're going to be right here in the Judges. And it's coming right on the heels of, remember, so you've got creation, then you've got Noah and the flood, then you got the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And then we've got Moses, leading everybody out of Egypt, out of slavery. And that's where they get the 10 Commandments, right? The 10 Commandments and all the law. And then the time of the Judges, a specific time in the history of God's people where they had the rule of law, but they had no actual king. And I want you to think about that. Name another location in the world that has the rule of law, but no actual king. The United States. Okay, so we function in something that has no king, but yet we follow law. And this kind of, for about 300 plus years in the time of the Judges, they function with law and they have a series of judges. Now, judge, when you hear the word judge, you think courtroom official, think military chieftain. That's a little bit better. And so every now and then when the people of God would fall into sin, they get conquered, and we're going to see that, and then they need someone to deliver them out of that. And that's where we're going to watch this. We're going to watch how Israel has this deep need to be delivered over and over and over again as they reach the time of the Judges. In fact, here's this next part I want to show you is this is my clip art, by the way. And you start with Joshua, who is a great leader. And then you got some good judges who do some good stuff as the people of Israel start to sin. And then you got an okay judge, because, God's got to work with some pretty crummy people. And then it gets worse, and he's got to work with some really desperately dark people. And then it gets really, really bad. In fact, this eventually comes to a point where the nation of Israel falls into a system and culture of violence, murder, rape, and ultimately civil war. That's how bad it gets. And the book of Judges is really a tragedy. There isn't like a happy ending. It ends really horrifically. And we're going to talk about that. We're kind of going to, this morning, we're going to do a little bit of an overview on the book of Judges, and then we're going to fill in those panels as we go through this series. So that's where we're going. We're going to start out in actually the book of Joshua. So if you made it to page 200, turn back one page in the Bible. We're in Joshua chapter 24. And remember, Joshua was the guy that wrote Moses' right-hand man. And so what Joshua did, he hung out with Moses, he learned his leadership style, and then he was the one that went into the land of Canaan and drove out the bad people, and or as much as he possibly could, and then he's about to die. And so we're about to see his farewell speech where Joshua is sort of going to commission and make a covenant with God's people. Here it is. Joshua 24, verse 14. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods your father serves in the region beyond the river, and the river is the Jordan River, and the gods of the godless people, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so, you know how we talk about sometimes there's coffee cup verses? This is plaque in your house verses. How many of you guys have this verse in your house? How many? About 7, 8, 9. Okay, good. We got a bunch of you guys have this verse in your house. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. All right? So Joshua's making a statement. It's pretty huge. In verse 16, and the people go, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods, for it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight, and who preserved us in all the way that we went, and among the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore, we will also serve the Lord, for he is our God. And that sounds really great, right? Everyone's like, yeah, we're going to do whatever it takes. Now, this next verse that Joshua's going to come back, it's kind of, I don't know if it's like old man syndrome, where you're just cynical and grumpy when you're about to die. But Joshua, he starts taunting the people. Nah, you're not going to do it. There's no way. In fact, look at this. Look at this. Verse 19. Then Joshua said to the people, you're not able to serve the Lord. You're pretty much pathetic. I've seen you guys. For he is a holy God. He's a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. And everybody was glad they came to church that day. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you, after having done you good. And then the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. And then verse 22, then Joshua said to the people, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him. And they said, we are witnesses. And then he said, then put away the foreign gods that are among you and incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, the Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day. The Israelites made a covenant to worship God alone. And now this is good news. We're designed to worship. I don't know if you guys knew that. We are designed. God made us, and this is kind of a weird thing to say, especially if you're not a Christian. We are designed to be ruled. God made us and put in our hearts a desire to worship something. Now, we are desired to worship, and God is the object of our affection ultimately. But for a lot of us, we don't worship God. But there will come a time, and in fact, we just talked about the Great Adventure in our announcements this morning. If you don't know what Great Adventure, it's kind of like our youth program where we get all of our youth kids, and they're going to go to boot camp, and then we get the whole church together to reach our neighbors. That's kind of the whole point. Now, when our youth go to boot camp, that's kind of that's like youth camp, just same words, just we're really intentional about training people on it. What happens, and for those of you who grow up in church, you can answer from your seats at home. I'm going to give you one guess. What happens the last night of youth camp? Everybody cries. Everybody cries. It's like the weirdest thing. It's like cry night. Let's get this thing on. We're going to all bawl our eyes out. And like, you don't even have to be sad. But, it's like everybody cries. Guys cry, girls cry. I mean, the girls, it's like, snotty tears. Guys are just like, I don't know why I'm crying. And that just happens to everybody. Now, there's a part of it, like they don't sleep for a week. That's kind of deals in, they get all emotional. They have all these great relationships, all these really cool experiences. And then the last night, they all bawl their eyes out. Now, if you've had no church experience, that's why we're weird, okay? So, that we do things like that. All right, so what happens is that everybody makes commitments to never do anything ever again. You guys remember this? You burn everything. You're never going to listen to that. You're never going to be around those people. And then for a while, you're really judgmental. And that's why for a lot of you guys, in high school, you'd have seasons where you really hated some of the Christian people until they finally got over themselves. You guys remember that? Okay, good. So this is camp life is sort of what we do. And here's the reality. We actually do this as adults now. We had a men's retreat. I don't know if you guys know this. Back in February, we had a men's retreat. We had 85 men going on a men's retreat. Yeah. That is, I don't know if you're not in church world, that's unheard of. That 85 men go on a men's retreat. All right, and the last day of our men's retreat, we all stood up and we kind of did the same thing at youth camp. We're all going to burn stuff and make commitments to stuff we're never ever going to do again. And it was really an amazing experience to see grown men start crying. I was like, who knew this would happen for men too? But what we do is this is why I really view this as like the last week of camp, is because everyone's making this commitment to Joshua and to God. We are never, ever going to leave you. We're going to do whatever it takes. And for a while, they do. For a while, this people do what God has called them to do. They're convicted. They know they're designed for worship. They're going to follow God with all their heart, all their mind, all their soul, and all their strength. And then something happens. And this is where I wanted to read this with you. We're going to go to Judges 2. Joshua dies, and we're going to see what happens. Look at Joshua chapter 2. Start at verse 10. And all that generation also are gathered to their fathers. That's the generation of Joshua. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. And then what happened? And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. Or if you're like reading this for the first time, you're going to go like, oh, they spelled that wrong. It should be Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers who brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth, which everybody in the audience goes, what's a Baal and an Ashtaroth? All right, I'm going to try and explain that for you. Here we go. There was this ancient Near Eastern god named El, and he hooked up with another ancient Near Eastern god named Asheroth. And they had a son, a god's son, and his name is Baal. And he was like a fertility god, and he controlled storms. So like his like little logo would be like him holding lightning bolts and be like, yeah. And so he made the grass grow. And if you've been in the military, what makes the grass grow greener? Who knows? Blood makes the grass grow greener. That's right. And so when there was a person that had, so they required blood to make the grass grow greener. And so part of Baal worship was sacrificing your firstborn son or daughter. That was kind of weird, right? And you're like, oh. Now, you would think that the people of Israel would be like, we don't do that. But they got they wanted to be good neighbors, and so they fell for their next door neighbor's gods. And so they started to worship, and eventually when you worship, you serve wholeheartedly Baal, and then you got to sacrifice a kid or two. And that happens. And everyone's just like, are you serious? Okay, so that was one part. Child sacrifice was part of it. And then the Ashtaroth is like another like sister goddess to Baal was Ashtaroth, or you may know her as Ishtar. She was a fertility goddess as well, but the way that you worship is that you would have sex with temple prostitutes, okay? And it's not like you signed up. It's like, you know what, one day I'm going to be a temple prostitute. My dream is going to be a temple prostitute. It was early forms of sex trafficking. So like if you've heard of like sex trafficking, girls are kidnapped, said like, guess what? You're going to have sex with these guys, and that's just kind of your new life. They're like, that's terrible. And so what would happen, sex trafficking would happen. These women were like slaves, and they were like, their job was to have sex with the men that came to the temple. And so it wasn't hard to get men to come to church in those days. And so what would happen is that these guys would just abuse, and like these women were like, that was sort of their job and their role and their part of their life. And so that's sort of what happened. So you had like sacrificing of firstborn children, and you'd have sex trafficking, and that became sort of like the culture, and that's what the people of God were leaving. Now here's the thing about it. God had called Israel to be a holy nation. And everybody was supposed to look at this holy nation that had this rule of law that was unbelievably wonderful. And it took care of women, and it took care of children. Like, it was liberal and progressive compared to everything else. Everyone was like, whoa, you're taking care of people. That's crazy. It's every man for himself. We can do what we want to do when we want to do it, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. And women really aren't people, neither are kids. That was the culture. And so they forsook that as they started to serve the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Okay, verse 14. So what happened? God ain't happy. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. So here it is. The Israelites broke their covenant to worship God alone, okay? And what they did, I mean, when we saw it, is they started to sacrifice their children. I mean, when you think about who would do such a barbaric thing and sacrifice children. Now, I don't want to get too political, but who would do that? But that was exactly what's going on. Okay, and here's the reality. When we sacrifice children, you're like, well, how does that even connect to me? I don't do that. Okay, fair enough. Here's how we do this. We can sacrifice children physically, as a lot of our children do get sacrificed physically, but we can sacrifice children at the altar of my career God. We can sacrifice our children at the altar of I want to be happy God. Because what happens is there are consequences to the choices we make, and you might be saying, this doesn't harm anybody. But you are going to find that the consequences of the choices you make will harm people, and that somebody might be you, and that somebody might be the ones that come after you. And I know this because I'm one of those kids that when my dad went through that time in his life, you call it midlife crisis or whatever, after we built the car together, I just didn't see my dad very often. I mean, it'd be a month or two in between of his visits, and sometimes he'd come back, get a couple tools, and he'd head off to his other house in Atlanta, and I mean, it just was a new world, and it's not like they hadn't gotten divorced yet, but there were some things going on the side, and I definitely think that he broke a lot of covenants, if you know what I mean. And so I remember being in high school, and I wrote this in my journal, and it's kind of weird to think that I journal as a high school kid, but I did. And I wrote, I just wish I had someone to talk to about relationships. I wish I had someone to talk to about life. There is nobody I can turn to. Nobody understands me. And so my dad, in his pursuit of like, he would always come home sometimes just like, hey, one day I'm going to buy you a Lamborghini. And at first I was like, sweet, Lambo. And then eventually I'm like, no, I'd just rather have you home. And I have a feeling that you're delusional at this point because the Lambo never came. And he started to spiral. And things got darker for him. And he ultimately had to leave a great job at IBM because he was always a guy that bucked the system. And in blue suit world, you don't buck the system, and eventually it spiraled really bad. And so I've told you guys this story once before, but eventually he left my mom, and then one day I'm at a judo tournament in Annapolis, Maryland, at the Naval Academy. My dad comes to drive in to see me, and he's like, hey, guess what? I got married. And so, hey, do you want to go meet my wife? And I'm like, like as a 19, 20-year-old going like, what is going on? What happened? And I'll be honest with you. I think I was crippled emotionally for about 10 years. It took about 10 years for me to get to a place where I didn't just kind of go in, have relationships with a girl or something, and just kind of destroy her, and then move on to the next one, have a relationship, and destroy that one. And it took me about 10 years to get past that because I was broken. And I didn't have anyone to go, hey, how do I do this thing of dating? How do I do this thing of relationship? What should I do with my life? And so the consequence of my dad sort of checking out was that I kind of hurt a lot of people over and over and over again as I did the same thing. And I'd be like, I'm never going to do that again. Been there? And that's sort of what happens when you start to break your covenant. You don't just affect you. You affect a lot of people around you. You affect sons and daughters. You affect brothers and sisters. You affect the neighborhood because things get broken. And ultimately my dad would die. And my dad died about 3 years ago, and it was sort of heartbreaking because he just worked himself to death trying to make the next million. He never got over that thing of trying to get to the Lambo. It was sad. And that's the sort of thing that sort of happened with the Israelites, is that they at one time had this real heart for God. My dad even at one time when I said, hey, Dad, I feel like I'm being a pastor, he's like, yeah, I felt like that once. And then the conversation just stopped right there. We never talked about it again. It was really a weird deal. But at some point, he had a relationship with Jesus that was really, really tight and really, really close, and then life sort of happened. And it spiraled. And so this is what happens with the nation of Israel. It goes from bad to worse, and then Judges 19 to 21 talks about how bad it got. All right, and I'm gonna read and summarize and read some of it just to kind of let you in, because you're not going to believe me on how bad it got, because this is stranger than fiction. All right, you don't, like, if you go to write this story, you wouldn't make it up like this, because it's, well, unless you're like a Halloween movie maker or some sort, because that's kind of how bad it gets. All right. Judges 19, verse 1, look at this. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite. Now, if you don't know what Levi is, that's like a priest. Like, Levites were supposed to be priests who served their community in which they lived, and they would, do priestly things, like serve the people. A certain Levite was sojourning, traveling, in the remote parts of the hill country Ephraim. He was like a rural country priest who took to himself a concubine. Now, that's a weird thing. Do we know what concubines are? Google it real quick. You'll find out. All right, so concubine and a priest don't go together because Levite priests were supposed to have one wife. In fact, everybody in Israel was supposed to have one wife, and you didn't take on multiple wives, and you didn't sex traffic, which is essentially what a concubine is. You starting to take on the culture of the country that you're in. That's what everybody else did, and he wants to be like everybody else, and so he just wants to be happy. Who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Okay, so then here's kind of like the series of things that happen. His concubine, which is kind of weird to think about, cheats on him, right? So like, he has another wife, but then he's got the concubine. The concubine cheats on him, and he's pretty upset about that. So she leaves, and for 4 months, goes back home to her father-in-law. And then after a while, the Levite kind of misses the action on the side, and so he goes down to his father-in-law, because sort of father-in-law, goes to his father-in-law's house, and he speaks kindly to the concubine, and they kind of kiss and make up. And then the father-in-law's like, he kind of wants to protect his daughter because he knows that she's kind of like second class in his house. And he says, why don't you stay another day? And he gets the Levite drunk, and then he can't leave the next day because the journey's too far, and he wakes up with a hangover around noon. Okay? This is all in the Bible. You guys should read it more. And then the next day he does the same thing. He gets Levi drunk. He stays around. I was like, oh, don't leave. It's too late. He's like, okay. And then day after day after day. And then eventually the Levi's like, look, I got to go back home. I got a wife and family to take care of, for crying out loud. Come on, concubine. And they start leaving, right? And then they head back, and they're traveling. And you don't want to leave around noon because if you have to travel like more than 6 hours, which they had to do, it's going to get dark, and it's dangerous when it gets dark. So they end up in the city of Gibeah, and it's getting dark, and he says, we're going to stay here in Gibeah. Now, what you do, because there aren't any hotels in the land, so what you do is you stay in the town square, and then somebody kind of notices you, and they take you home. That's sort of like travelers were supposed to be really respected because you never know if you're serving an angel or something that was disguised. Okay. So then people start giving him the stink eye. You ever gotten a stink eye from people? You're like, where's that guy from? Or, I mean, some of you guys gotten stink eyes at church before, and you're like, what'd I do? Anyway, another story, another sermon, another time. Okay. So anyway, these people are getting the stink eye, and he's like feeling a little bit uncomfortable. It's getting darker, and it's really weird that no one's taking him home. And finally, an old guy, he's a Benjamite. He was traveling from his fields, going back home, and he sees this Levite and his concubine and his servant there in the square, and he's like, hey, you guys got a place to stay? Like, no one's taking us in. It's like, come on. So he takes him home, and then they do what people do, is they got drunk, and they got a big party. It was just, the old guy and the Levite and his servant and his concubine and that guy's family. And then all of a sudden, the people that were giving stink eyes in the town square, they start pounding on the door. And I wanted to kind of show you this verse because it's freaky and scary and very bad. Judges 19, verse 22. And as they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out that man who came into your house, that we may... And just for sake of all people here, we won't put what that next part is because it's gross and disgusting and very bad. Very, very, very bad. They're going to do bad things. Use your imagination of bad things. Okay. And so the response of the old man, the Benjamin, is like, no, don't do that. So that's good. He's like, no, don't do that. And then he does something this is like the weird twist of the story. Here, take my daughter, my virgin daughter, and do with her whatever you want, but don't touch my guest. And then, the man's sort of terrified, and he's like, yeah, take my concubine too. And the Bible says, he forces her outside. Here you go. That's what you're there for, because that's what you do. And so then they go back to eating and drinking, like, oh, wow, do you hear anything outside? It's like the scuffling and screaming and all the things that happen. And then eventually he goes to sleep. And then he wakes up in the morning, and he's like, I wonder where my concubine is. And then he opens the door, all right? Now, this is how sick it's gotten. He sees his concubine, like, who'd been crawling, scratching at the door all night, and she's just laying there. And he kind of gives her like hey, get up, let's go home. But there was no answer. This is a Levite priest who just simply did what anybody would want to do. He just wants to be happy. And, what's one on the side? Everybody else is doing it. and she's just a concubine. I mean, the rest of the culture doesn't value these people, so why should I? Because that's just kind of, so he takes her, she cheats on him, and so it kind of serves her right a little bit that she cheated on him, even though he was, like, he's having stuff on the side from his wife. And then, so it sort of serves her right. So then, he's like, what should I do now? And so what he does is he takes his concubine home, puts her on the back of the horse, heads home, and then when he gets home, he's angry. He's like, how could these people do this to me? And then he's going to do a social media post. At this time, there was no social media to do a sweet post with, so because if he just writes a letter to everybody, he's like, this really happened, they abused my concubine, and this is just sick stuff, and just sent letters to everybody, everyone would be like, eh. So he's got to do something graphic. There's got to be like a picture, and like he wasn't that good of an artist, and so he's like, okay, how am I going to do this? There was no cameras, no selfies, and so he just is like, I don't know, and he just chops up the body and makes 12 pieces and sends it to the 12 tribes of Israel and says, this is what happened. Choose for yourselves what you should do. And he's like inciting a riot. And he gets real sick. In fact, here's what happens next is that the 12 tribes get this letter and like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened. And then they all make pledges. No one's ever going to let their daughter marry a Benjamite ever. And they make a commitment because it was just they had never seen anything like this before. Things had gotten so bad. They knew that was wrong. They may not be perfect. We're not perfect. We're not doing that. And then they're like, we need to do something. We need to go punish those guys. And so they tell the Benjamite people, like, bring out the worthless fellows. We're going to put them to death because that is wrong. We should value people. And so the Benjamites, no, if you're going to get to these Gibeah people, you got to go through us. And so, oh yeah? And so about 400,000 warriors from Israel, all the 11 tribes, surround the city of Gibeah, and then Benjamin gets 26,000 guys, and then we have civil war. And after about 3 days of fighting and war, the Benjamites are slaughtered, and about 26,000 Benjamites die. And they kill every man, woman, and child that they can find to punish them. And then they go, oh no, we just killed everybody. That's really bad. We're not going to, there's only 11 tribes now. What are we going to do? We didn't mean to go that far. And then someone's like, hey, I heard there's 600 Benjamite men that escaped into the wilderness. And they're like, oh, great. Maybe we can start over with them. They're like, oh no, there's a dilemma because we just promised we would never let our women marry a Benjamite man. What are we going to do? And they go, is there anybody who didn't go into battle against Gibeah? And they're like, oh, there was one country. It was Jabesh Gilead. They didn't fight. Okay, and someone's like, I got a plan. This seems right to me. Let's go and wipe out the city of Jabesh Gilead, and then we'll kill every man, woman, and child. And then all the virgin women, we can be like, we'll woo the men from Benjamin in. We'll say, hey, sorry, we killed all your friends and your wives, your families, everybody. But here's a new wife. And so they do. So they go wipe out the city of Jabesh Gilead. They take all the virgins. They say, hey, good news, bad news. Bad news, everyone you know is dead. Good news, here's some new wives. Start all over. And then there's like, they're like, oh, that's a pretty good consolation. And there's like 200 Benjamites who are like, hey, I didn't get a wife. And they're like, oh, no, what are we going to do? And so the rest of Israel is like, I know what we can do. All right, we're going to have a big party like we always do. And then all of our virgin women are going to do like this dance thing to kind of celebrate their awesomeness of being women. And then we can have the Benjamite men who need wives, they can hide. And then at the right moment, when the women are dancing, they can ambush it, kidnap a wife, and then it won't be the fault of the fathers because they didn't know. This is like a legit, seriously, you guys need to read your Bible. This is actually going on. This is like worse than novellas and soap operas and anything you could ever imagine. This is way more insane. Okay, so then they do that. And so the Benjamite nation, all these 600 men have wives, and then it ends. And this is the verse it ends with. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Israel broke down because they made their own morality. This is a tragedy. Like, this is what happens when everybody's like, no, don't judge me. Stop telling me what to do. I can do what I want to do, when I want to do it, who I want to do it with. as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. But the problem is it's always going to hurt somebody because there's a consequence to sin, and sin is anything that you think, say, or do that goes against God's design. You were designed to worship God. Let's just go back to my dad for a second. I mean, why was my dad sort of broken? I mean, I had just recently got a video of my dad and my mom, like when I was a newborn, and you can see my dad not knowing what to do at all, like just kind of like, just like, and then I started to realize he never had a dad. He never had, my dad's dad died when my dad was 2. And so he never knew what it was like to have a dad. He had no idea. I mean, like, it was just really, I was really an affectionate person. Like, my mom and I were really close. And so I'd go and hug my dad, and he'd be like, it was just super weird for him. And eventually he got over it as I would just hug him and 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 hug him. And I'd kiss my dad and hug him and kiss him and hug him and kiss him. And he sort of got used to it, but he would always, like, he just didn't know how to be affectionate with his son. And just never had a clue. Had no idea. Because he had never had affection from a father. Because his dad died of cancer. And the way he got cancer was, he was in World War II, and he flew in a B-52 bomber, and then he flew in other bombs that carried nuclear bombs. And he had radiation exposure that killed him in a couple of months. And so the real reason that my dad kind of had that messed up was because he didn't have a dad, and the real reason that he didn't have a dad is because World War II, and World War II, because some insane guy who had a weird relationship with his dad, Hitler, came to power and had issues that he never worked out. And he worked them out through genocide, and he worked it out through murder, and he worked it out through trying to conquer people to fill that void in his soul. And that's what we do every day when we don't control our appetite, when we don't control our lusts, when we don't give those things over to God and worship as we were designed. And the effect that has is on the people who forget. Because it wasn't the real issue with the people of Israel that the fathers who knew Joshua and said all that stuff never got their sons and daughters together and said, hey guys, listen, we made this covenant because we know this is ultimate, there's life here. And perhaps they were making a lot of money. They were doing a lot of farming, and it was going really great. And you know what? They had some good buddies over there who showed them some great farming techniques who were balls. And every now and then they'd sacrifice a kid. And they're like, it's not so bad. I mean, it worked for them. It's going to work for us. We need to make some money. You see, that's what happens when we forget about the generation coming behind us. And we start sacrificing to the gods of our culture. And we put our children second. And we say, don't worry about it. And then they never know what it is to grow up to worship. And they grow up angry, and they grow up frustrated, and they grow up trying to fill that void in their lives with men, with women, with food, with drug, with drink, and over again they end up getting to this point, I'll never do that again, but they've been in this cycle of sin for so long they don't know how to get out. And that is the American story, even inside the church. There is hope, though. I mean, that sounds like you're just like, oh, thanks, Chris, that's depressing. All right. Listen, there is hope. And that hope obviously starts with Jesus, because Jesus saw the reckless attitude that we had. He saw that we couldn't save ourselves on our best day. We want to do the right thing for the right reason. So he sent his son Jesus, who died on the cross. And every month or so, regularly, we get together and we take bread and we break it. And this represents Jesus' body broken on the cross for you. He who knew no sin became sin on our behalf so that we might be the righteousness of God and worship as we were designed to worship, that relationship with God rekindled. And he shed his blood on the cross. And we were reminded of that by drinking the wine or the grape juice, where it represents his blood, shed for you and for all people for the forgiveness of sins. And ultimately, when you believe that Jesus died on the cross for your sins and rose from the dead, he becomes your king. And he says you can't make up your own morality, because making up your own morality will always leave you flat on your back and broken, spiraled out of control, because you can't rule you, because you are a natural born sinner. Just ask my 3-year-old Austin. And so this morning I have a question for you. Who is your king? Do you have a king? And the question is your king, is it Jesus? Is Jesus your king? And Jesus becomes your king when you believe that he died on the cross for your sins, rose from the dead, and you go, you are my God, and I will do whatever it is you want me to do. And so if you've never done that, if you've never said, Jesus, I want you to be my king, I believe that God, you sent your son Jesus to die on the cross for me, and he rose from the dead. If you've never done that, I challenge you to do that today and make him your king. Because that's where your hope comes from. In fact, I'm hoping that today you take communion, because today is the day that you made this decision that Jesus would be your king. And for the rest of us, we believe that. We believe Jesus died on the cross for our sins, rose from the dead. But there's a tendency in you, and there's a tendency in me to want to crawl back up on the throne. I want to do what I want to do when I want to do it. And you make up stuff about how it doesn't really hurt anybody, and you justify stuff, and that's why you drink too much, and that's why you drug too much, and that's why you video game too much, that's why you porn too much. That's why you do all those things that darken the soul, because you've justified it, because you look at it, everybody else is doing it. And how many of us, listen, how many of us as kids were going like, one day I'm just going to be like everybody else? High aspirations. Nobody said that. What we said was we want to do great things, and we want to help people. We want to do things for God that are unbelievable, and we want to love people like they've never been loved. And that's the heartbeat of Jesus. So I'm asking you this morning, before you come and take communion, I want you to wrestle with this question. Do you have a king? And who is your king? And are you serving the king of this culture and sacrificing your children, the ones that come behind you, enslaving people? You can say, I'm not really. Just own the part that you have and say, I want to commit and confess and get healing so that I can serve the true king. Would you guys pray with me? Father, I'm praying that this morning that somebody just responds to your call, that thing that you do in somebody's heart when they just can't control it, and maybe they're on the verge of tears, and you feel like, how do you know my story? How do you know? God, I'm praying that they would say, he knows my name, and it's you they're talking about, God, that you would penetrate a heart, you penetrate a soul, and they would just go, Jesus, save me. And in that moment, they would feel like this sense of worth, that there's no condemnation for the way they behaved in the past, because they've been set free by you and what your son did on the cross. And God, that they would take communion for the very first time tomorrow to kind of, in that sense, just spiritually represents how they are one with you, that you are the thing that feeds them and you are their king. And God, for the rest of us that have come to believe that you are our Savior, you are our King, and we have fought our way back onto the throne, would we just contemplate that, and would we maybe even confess that to our spouse or confess that to somebody in our discipleship group? Because what we are is we're so afraid that somebody's going to know we're not perfect. We're so afraid, God, that somebody's going to find out the dark things that we've done, and the reality is you already knew. And you call us to confess to one another so we could be healed. So God, I'm praying that we would make you our King, and we wouldn't fear man and what someone's going to think of us and all the dark things we've done, but rather we'd fear you. Remember, and we pass those lessons on to the generations following us, so we'd never forget and we'd never make up our own morality. In Jesus' name we pray. Before my dad died, we had opportunity to just really get a lot closer. And the beautiful thing was the gospel went right back up the family tree as he really started to understand the depth of God's love. And you know, the thing that's interesting is now that I'll have dreams about my dad. It's kind of a bizarre thing. I don't know if that's like a normal thing, but he's no longer kind of racked by pain. He's no longer, he's like a young guy, and we have just like conversations about like normal stuff. And I don't know what that means, but what I do know it means that I had a relationship with my dad that I treasured. I was able to show him God's amazing grace and love, so that no matter what point you're at with your family, you still have a chance now to make things right, even if it's your parents or your kids or the people that you care about the most, your immediate family. And my hope in my heart is you would not waste a day, because you are not guaranteed tomorrow. Stop making your own morality. Would you receive the benediction? Go. and be a people who are transfixed by the gospel. Go and be a people who want to show love right back up your family tree and down the family tree. Go and push back the darkness of our culture and have an awesome week of worship. You're dismissed.